So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining and welcome to this Insight Hub session. We will speak today about how to prevent, how to prepare, and how to respond to a human rights crisis. My name is Paulina Hagengruber. I'm the Director of Strategy and Business Development at Learning, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. I am a fully qualified lawyer, and I advise clients at Learning in the fields of public affairs and crisis communications. These topics have shaped my professional life for 20 years now. A quick intro to those who don't know us yet. Learning is an international management consultancy based in Berlin. We are specialized in business and human rights. We advise companies on all aspects of human rights and environmental due diligence. This includes also cases of human rights crisis. During this session today, we will have a look at how to prepare for crisis and how to respond to crisis. Crises are a broad and multi-layered topic. Our focus areas today will be in the fields of training, enhanced due diligence, and communications. Remediation is a crucial part of the conversation. To delve deeper into this important topic, we will be hosting a follow-up webinar on June 11th at 11 o'clock. There, we will focus specifically on remediation and phasing out of crisis. We will send you the registration link with the after webinar communication. I am here today with two of my colleagues. They are experts in crisis and enhanced due diligence. Leonel Lisboa is the head of Learning Academy. He advises companies in how to build the suitable capacities. He leads trainings and human rights crisis simulations. Leonel is an experienced Brazilian lawyer. He has been working for more than a decade in the field of business and human rights. Leonel played a pivotal role in the emergency response to the 2019 Brumadinho Dam collapse disaster. There, he was contributing to the design of reparation measures. Mariana Hizende is the technical lead of Learning's Enhanced Due Diligence workstream. She is responsible for designing tailored research methodologies for complex human rights risk scenarios. And she advises clients on effective courses of action. Mariana is a lawyer. She has been working for 5 years in the field of business and human rights. Before joining Learning, Mariana worked in Brazil as a case handler. There, she was involved in a reparations program for those affected by a mining dam break with international repercussions. Thank you both for joining today. Before we start, let me remind us of a few technical things. Our Insight Hub sessions are structured as 45-minute webinars. There we feature expert insights and interactive discussions with our audience. We'll begin with a 30-minute conversation on the topic, and the last 15 minutes will be dedicated to the Q&A session. Please use the Zoom Q&A function for your questions, not to be confused with the chat function. You can also upvote existing questions. This helps us to prioritize those questions most relevant to you. A recording of the webinar will be available for you afterwards. Today, we want to focus on how to prevent and how to prepare and how to respond to a human rights crisis. Let me give you 2 examples what we mean by the term human rights crisis. If you think of manufacturing companies in all industry sectors, for example, they are highly dependent on raw materials that are extracted in mines. You might think of cobalt mining in Congo, copper mining in Chile, or nickel mining in Indonesia. Mining is a sector with an increased risk of severe human rights violations, like forced labor or child labor. If, for example, a report shows the connection of your company to that, then crisis hits. But human rights crisis situations are not only focused on continents other than Europe. You might remember the media reports last summer on European luxury brands. The media coverage spoke about serious allegations against these companies. They allegedly exploited Chinese workers in Italy. Our conclusion? A human rights crisis can hit anywhere and anytime. Although it doesn't seem so, you can prevent it and prepare for it. Now I hand over to Lionel, who will guide you through the 3 phases of crisis.
Thank you, Paulina, and good afternoon to all who are watching us live now or in the recorded version. So yes, crises are very complex situations, and they often hit when it's the least ideal of the scenarios. So, and the crisis can have different triggers and very different shapes. Since we're talking about business and human rights crisis in abstract, I want to share here 2 general frameworks for dealing with crisis in general. If we're in a specific scenario, so we'll follow the same structure, but with a more detailed scenario analysis and more detailed information. But here, let's talk on more abstract scenarios, and then we use these 2 different frameworks for dealing with crisis. So first one is this that you're seeing on the screen. So 3 steps to manage a crisis. First is prevent and prepare. So our focus in this stage is to identify and disarm hidden bombs. The best is to prevent a crisis for anyone that can be affected by human rights violations, for the company, right? And one of the ways of identifying and disarming these hidden bombs is to conduct very good due diligence. Mariana is going to talk about this in a second. And it's also very important to build internal response capacities. So to have people working in the company prepared to actually work and take action when a crisis hits, and to have a plan in place, an emergency response plan, a crisis plan. Second is to respond, is to act fast to stop and reduce harm. And third is to remediate and phase out. So it's a moment where we repair and rebuild, and we return to business as usual with guardrails against repetition. We're going to get in more detail about phase 3 on the next coming Insight Hub. Now let's focus on steps 1 and steps 2. So focusing more now on step 1, preventing and preparing for a crisis. So it's very, very important to identify and address human rights risks and impacts. And the best way to do that is with due diligence. It's very important also to establish this baseline of trust and contacts. So this is stakeholder engagement that is going to be very, very important when a crisis happens, to be able to respond adequately and to be able to communicate information internally and externally with trust. And to put the structures in place for rapid response. This means having an emergency response plan, as I said, and also have the internal capacity, people trained to deal with that. But even if you prevent and prepare, it might be the case that a crisis happens. So on the second step, we deal with a crisis by responding to the crisis. So next slide. The immediate response is focused on the priorities that you see here, is to avoid and stop imminent harm to human life and human dignity. This is the objective, the first priority, together with protecting the company and preserving evidence. Very important, because it's the company that is going to be able to remedy the situation. So the company needs to be protected, and the evidence is very important for the other steps that are going to come later. So this is immediate response. And the short-term response is to start then internal investigations carefully to avoid the re-victimization and to collaborate with external investigations. And also important to keep the operations viable. So how can you keep the company working even if it is going through crisis? For that, you need strategically communicate internally and externally with stakeholders. And Paulina is going to talk a little bit about this in a minute. And to set up then the last part of this short-term response is to set up the remediation and reparation structure. Again, we're going to focus that on the next coming Insight Hub. So this is the framework for crisis response. And now on the next slide, there is an interesting framework that can be used for dealing with the moment of response exactly. So when we have a crisis, it's very hard, when the crisis hits, it's very hard to be able to come up with the first elements of response. You need to have a good emergency plan, and the emergency plans, as we know, many of them are required by law, depending on the kind of infrastructure or kind of building or kind of factory that exists. But not always those emergency plans are connected with human rights and can actually respect human rights. So we'll share with you a slide now showing what we call FACA framework, which is based on fact, analysis, cause, and action. So these are the four things, the four questions that you have to ask to be able to ask yourself and get very quick answers. This is not a full analysis system. There are other methods to go on full analysis of root causes and so on. This is a first moment, a first response framework. So first you ask yourself these questions. So for the fact, you ask yourself what, where, when happened. Then you ask how bad was it? What happened? So what is the cause? Why it happened? And then we focus on action. Diving it in more detail, so next slide, let's focus a little bit on fact. So what are the things that we need to deal when we are asking ourselves the elements of fact? We need to define in one simple sentence what happened. It's often that where and when can be implicit as well. And if you're having more than one sentence, maybe you're talking about more than one fact. So try to isolate one fact and be able to have one sentence to describe what happened. Then we move to analysis. So on the next slide, we think we find a way to describe the fact and to analyze the source, the pattern of dissemination, the current impacts and future impacts. So this can be a crisis that starts as a reputational crisis. It can be a crisis that starts as an environmental impact. It can be a crisis based on human rights violations of workers, let's say in a situation of forced labor. So then you look, what is the source, where it happened geographically and technically, what is the pattern of dissemination, current impacts and future impacts. Basically, you're asking, how bad is this? So how far does it reach? How many people? How much does it cost? How long has this been going on? And how long is this going to continue being going on? Next, we are going to ask ourselves about the cause. So we need to establish one or few causes. This is tricky because when we start asking ourselves about causes, it can go forever. So this is a first level analysis, and we need to find the cause behind the event, behind the fact. So we're looking for immediate causes at this moment. Then we can go on root cause analysis and other kinds of investigations in the future. And next step is action. So what now? What can we do? So we need to describe actions to be taken immediately, in the short term, and mid to long term. And again, I want to repeat, because this is very relevant and very important that we have this in our minds. The immediate action has to seek reducing and stopping harm to human life and human dignity, and reducing or stopping harm for the company, and preserve the evidence. Because those the evidence that can be preserved at that moment is going to be very important in the future. Yeah, and since we talked all about these complex elements of dealing with crisis, these two frameworks, on the next slide, I want to talk quickly about Learning Academy and how we deal with that. So any organization in any organization, it is people that deal with crisis. So people need to be prepared. Of course, you need a good plan, but we need to have people prepared for that. And we designed tailored crisis preparedness and management programs. So it works in half a day or 2-day long course, depending on the needs of the clients. And we do this for management level. And the program covers the cognitive and emotional tools for handling a crisis, the adequate standards for responding to it, the general and industry-specific requirements, and how to connect the emergency response plans to make them respect human rights. And very important, how we can use crisis as disruptive opportunities for change. Sometimes we need to have a change inside our organizations, and when a crisis hits, the level of disruption is such that allows us to move forward on some other things, to avoid mistakes and other violations. We have interactive methods, and we have human rights crisis simulations. And our idea is to imprint these first-minute tools that we mentioned here and others, and some structured processes, so that people can work and respond quickly to a crisis with the best quality possible. Thank you, and back to you, Paulina.
Thank you, Lionel. Before I hand over to Mariana, I would like to encourage everyone to also ask questions and put them into the Q&A. And now, Mariana, I hand over to you to explain to us how enhanced due diligence can help to prevent crisis and how it can help us when crisis hits.
Of course. Thank you, Paulina, and thank you, Lionel, also for setting the scene. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Yeah, and to answer the question, I need to, of course, get back to the mention that Lionel already brought up on stressing how prevention and preparedness are key steps in dealing with crisis. This can mean, in the sense, it can mean being able to avoid crisis altogether, or having the necessary knowledge at hand to respond to them once a crisis hit. So human rights due diligence, as I suppose many of you know, is the process of identifying, preventing, and mitigating risks. And sometimes companies are operating or sourcing from environments that are particularly volatile or repressive, and are therefore particularly prone to generate crisis. And some of the challenges in these scenarios are the local complexities and geopolitical risks, so complex political and cultural structures, where intricate local dynamics make it difficult for companies to used to operating in different contexts to fully understand the environment. Or maybe it can also be the case that there is limited access to information in that context, either because there isn't so much information available online, because freedom of press is restricted, or because the physical access to the area is even dangerous, which make it hard. All of this that can make it hard to access on-the-ground information. Some other challenges are, for example, business partner risks, where you have challenges in getting direct information or transparency from your business partners. Similarly here with transparency issues, and now you're thinking about how global supply chains have become increasingly opaque and difficult to map out, given the complexity of the supply chains. And it might also be the case that you're operating in a context where there are regulatory conflicts, where local laws or local standards are not aligned with international human rights standards, and which increases the risks of violation. And that is where enhanced due diligence can help you with. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Enhanced due diligence is not per se a different kind of due diligence, rather an intensification of it. And we are here at our approach at Learning, we are focusing on combining technological solutions and local and technical expertise. We're always engaging with people, with local and technical experts to validate all of our findings throughout the processes. Enhanced human rights due diligence is rooted in proportionality. So the idea is the higher the risk, the more robust, the more tailored the due diligence process for your company should be. And this here are the steps that we combine to create an approach that is suited to offer companies the information that they need to be prepared to and respond to a crisis. So first one, we're talking about research and gathering information, and this is where the bulk of the use of the technological approach takes place. We can talk about open source intelligence research, both text, image, video content. We can also look for a specific internet for keywords using local sources, researching at local language, even when there's more challenges in finding sources, in finding experts that can act in local language. That's something that we go the extra mile to find. We can also talk about researching government documents, corporate websites, video platforms, social media. And we then curate and engage specialized service providers that can conduct this data research, and we can use web crawling. We can also use methodologies such big data analysis, and this all will depend on the specific context and the client's needs, and what is the risk that you want to avoid, what is the crisis that you have identified as a potential crisis and you want to avoid. Then the scenario that you want to act upon will define the right technological approach. And our role then is to ensure that all the information collected by these providers is relevant, accurate, actionable, and bringing then these findings into a broader analysis of contextualization that we provide to companies. So we won't stop at third-party information or sources, but rather check the sources, engage with the right people, with both local experts, but also technical experts. If you're talking, let's say, for example, I guess a common topic is forced labor. We might engage specifically with people that are acting on forced labor on the specific geographical region that we're investigating, to test and to validate any hypothesis. And we build then on the research and knowledge for a global network of academics, think tanks, lawyers, international organizations. So you can really make sure that you're really not stuck into the surface. As you know, some things are over-reported, some problems are under-reported. If you just rely on what is in a superficial layer of information available online, you might miss out on a lot of the risks and of the possible crisis. And then analyze and contextualize, which means transforming all of this data into actionable insights. And then the main message here, we engage with people, for people, with the goal of going beyond generic models and surface level data to really understand and contextualize the facts that we're working with. And if we go to the next slides, you see how that this approach really approach that will allow you to help companies in crisis. So the first one is, of course, be prepared, understand the risks early to prevent costly crises, ensure business continuity, avoid interruptions in your supply chain, especially when you're talking about decisions in high-risk contexts that also allow for fast, informed action. Let's say that a factory is linked to a forced labor or a partner is sanctioned. Companies that have conducted enhanced due diligence, they are not starting from scratch. They'll have the initial data that they'll be able to work with, and they'll also allow them to respond to regulators, to stakeholders, to external scrutiny by providing the documentation and the insight companies need to respond, to put in place the measures to respond to such a crisis. And of course, most importantly here is supporting strategic decisions, having the best information available, contextualized and already transformed and already translated into actionable insights, equips you to decide. And that means empower you to make the decisions that's best suited to your company's unique situation. Whether you choose to engage your suppliers, you have to engage with the situation, whether the decision is to mitigate or to responsibly exit some of the challenging human rights contexts. Having the appropriate information is what allows you to make the best possible decision in such a scenario by then avoiding and also responding to crisis. Back to you, Paulina.
Thank you, Mariana. Before we dive into your questions, I'd like to have a view on key aspects of communications in a human rights crisis. First of all, also in crisis communication, preparation is key. Preparation helps you not to be overwhelmed when crisis hits. Responsibilities and processes should be clear before it hits. And when it hits, these three pillars are key for communications: truth, consistency, and empathy. Truth. Only tell the people what you know, don't lie to them, and don't promise. This sounds very simple, but in most cases it is not simple. Often it takes time to really know the facts. Mariana told us about enhanced due diligence as a research method when crisis hits. This takes time. And then you have facts and you have to check them with lawyers and other units in your company. This takes time. And at the same time, in crisis, what you know can change any minute. Allegations come up, a new media report is showing, employees are talking about things. So it's really very challenging to stick to the truth. But this is necessary. It is not only necessary from a legal point of view, but also to regain trust from stakeholders and rights holders. Consistency. This is strongly connected to truth. Stick to your message and repeat your message. What we often experience is that different departments in the company communicate contradictory statements. So, for example, the comms people tell the media one story, and the messaging at the consumer hotline is another one. This undermines not only the credibility of the company, but this also hinders the rebuilding of trust. What you need is one communication strategy. This is key. One communication strategy with coordinated messages for every stakeholder. And often, especially the own employees, get to know about the communications through the media. So don't forget to communicate to them and support also them with messaging, as family and friends, customers and their network might reach out to them. This reduces uncertainty for the people who have to communicate, but also for the stakeholders receiving the message and the same message again. And it helps to lower the tension in a very, very stressful situation. Empathy. When a human rights crisis hits, there are in most cases terrible effects on human beings. We talked about forced labor, child labor, dam breaches. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. So get into the shoes of the people affected. Communicate for and to them and not to the media. Listen to them. And this is not only a nice to have skill in these situations, but it should be seen as a strategic imperative. Being empathetic helps you to prepare the ground to build the bridge for solutions at eye level with the people affected. And actions are necessary to rebuild trust and phase out of crisis. All three are key for regaining trust of stakeholders and rights holders and are the basis for action. Crisis is not finished with words, but with actions. We come to that more advanced in our next webinar when we talk about remediation and rebuilding of trust and reputation. Now we will have a look at the questions, and please join in anytime. So we have one question concerning mid and long-term or immediate actions. Could you perhaps provide an example to illustrate it more clearly, the difference between them? I don't know. Leonel, would you go ahead?
Sure. Thank you, Paulina. Differentiating between immediate response and immediate actions and these longer ones. So again and again, the most important is to stop and prevent harm to human life and human dignity, preserve the company and preserve evidence. So these are the action, all the actions that are necessary to do that are the ones that are the immediate response actions. So this is going to depend on the crisis. There are crises where human lives are in danger immediately. There are situations that human lives are not in danger immediately. So this is going to, the actions are going to change, are going to be different depending on the kind of the crisis and the kind of needs that people have. For mid and long-term response, so then we're going to look on how can we keep the company viable and how can we go on investigations without violating the rights of others. And since I am speaking here, just wanted to pick one question from the Q&A here that is also connected to what I'm saying. So there is a question on which types of crisis companies are most frequently unprepared for and why. So crisis can generally have two kinds of triggers. You either have a substantial trigger or a procedural trigger. The substantial trigger is when something actually happens that causes impact, and that is the trigger of the crisis. So in the example that we mentioned, the dam bridge of a mining company dam bridge, that is clearly a substantial event. If you have in the Rana Plaza case, for example, that the collapse of the building is the trigger of a crisis and it is substantial. But you have situations, you have procedural triggers. So things that are like human rights violations, imagine a situation of forced labor that is going on in your supply chain. And one investigation by law enforcement or by journalists or by an NGO identifies it, makes it public, and connects it with your brand. So that is a procedural trigger. Companies have to be prepared to deal with both kinds of crises that come from those triggers. It is very it is generally devastating to deal with crises that have substantial triggers when they cause human damage to human life and violations of human dignity strikingly in one moment. So that is very hard for companies to deal with. But this is a very complex scenario with many kinds of crises that can happen. So the best is for companies to have a plan in place and people prepared to deal with crisis when it happens, because things need to be adjusted very, very fast when a crisis starts.
Thank you, Leonel. Maybe can I hand over the same question to you, Mariana, as you are the technical lead of our enhanced due diligence and often in the center of or leading projects where companies got hit by crisis. What is your experience? Which types of crises are companies most frequently unprepared for?
Yeah, I feel that especially when it comes to human rights crisis, and when I read the question, I thought it directly on an example that I'll try to share also with you. As of course, the worst kind of crisis is the one that you're not prepared to deal with, right? That you're not in your radar. And I'd like to give an example just to make it a bit more concrete when it comes to human rights crisis. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on what is their expectations from consumers, but also regulators on what does it look like, especially when you're talking about connections that might be through suppliers, let's say, but even your first direct tier suppliers. I had one of these cases that I supported last year. It was a company that had a well-structured risk management processes and policies in place. And when they were prioritizing and conducting the human rights risk assessment, the risk analysis, and to understand which companies and which suppliers they would prioritize, they did not engage with anyone that was really aware or knowledgeable about the region where they were acting, nor with experts on the thing. So what happened is a couple months later, they got a request by the regulator to explain why was this on the news? Why is this allegation on the news? Were you aware of this? Have you done anything to mitigate these risks? And what is your position towards this? And when we were talking to them, we realized that they removed some of the suppliers that had been cited, thinking that they were low risk. They were based on how some of these activities were executed in their home country, without transporting and analyzing how the situation actually takes place in the country of the operation. And therefore, one of their direct suppliers, really with whom they had a contract, was directly connected to this crisis. So there is a very clear situation where you need to be to really engage with experts here, is to understand what is the context that this activity is taking place. And this means both preparing for crisis. This could mean that they would have filtered their suppliers beforehand. They would maybe not be connected to this supplier if they had prioritized them. Or it could also mean that they would have identified this risk and have been able to engage with the suppliers. So by the time they are in the crisis, they'll be able to have an answer, right, to the regulator, which was instead of starting from scratch in this whole engagement process, when you're already under pressure, you are reacting, you don't have so much space to negotiate, really need to give, as Leonel mentioned, rapid answers to really deal with the crisis that is taking place at that moment. So I really had to think about this, this kind of situation.
That is very good. Thank you, Mariana. We have the question, I don't know if anybody can answer it, concerning what is a good case in crisis handling. So I think one problem is that we don't know all the facts at the end. I don't know if there is really a good case where we have all facts available, or if anybody of my colleagues has something at hand.
Could answer the question without actually answering the question, just commenting on it, because crises are messy by nature. So it is very hard to have an example that we could share in this environment that is like a staple of a fantastic answer, because there are going to be mistakes, there are going to happen in the process of responding to a crisis, even if the people are prepared and there is a good emergency response. Because the whole point of a crisis is that it is something that is overwhelming. So it is going to be very hard to respond. There are best and worst examples, but there is not a perfect example that could be like a benchmark, I would say. And I just wanted to chip in on another question quickly, the one about how should companies engage with affected communities during crisis, especially if trust has already been broken. So Paulina already mentioned some of these elements, and I want to take some of them and other stuff from experience and to answer the question. It's about being human. That's the first and foremost thing. If you work in the company and you as a person have to deal with, or you lead the people that have to talk to members of a community that have been affected by an event, a crisis, is about reminding that we are always human first, and then we have other roles. So you are first human, and then you are a worker in that company. You are first human, and then a member of that community that was affected. At human level, with real respect and real empathy, people connect. So even if the trust for the company has been broken, the trust between people can exist. If people are very human, humble, respectful, so then it is possible, because they understand, members of a community under a crisis situation understand, if they're talking to you and you are a worker, that you are a person. So it is, and they will cooperate, they will engage respectfully if you engage respectfully with them. Of course, there are situations when things are, emotions are very heightened. So it is also important to know when to engage respectfully, understanding the waves of emotions that go on when you have different kinds of impacts.
Mm-hmm. Thank
Can
you,
I add
Lionel.
a thought to that?
I'd like to ask you, as a former case handler, what is your experience on that, Marlena?
And I think connecting the two questions regarding good examples and engaging with community, I would definitely stress that the good example requires engagement, and it's not easy. It's hard, as Leonel mentioned, it's messy. And I wanted to share a bit of my experience, because I worked almost 3 years as a case handler, and I was dealing directly with people affected that had their lives really turned upside down, in more or less in different ways, but very hardly indirectly affected. And there was a change in the person. There was a change in how people would buy into this conversation, because we stayed. Because in the beginning there was a lot of anger, there was more personal attacks. It was much more challenging. Like the lawyers and the people representing the affected people, they were not sure if they should participate, if they would even sit at the table with us. There was a lot of mistrust, and of course there was. And as the response developed and created good results, not perfect, not saying that everyone is happy with this, but delivered good results, appropriate results for those most hardly affected. More people came to sit on the table, to participate in the conversations. Does not mean that everyone was happy with the end results, but we definitely saw a shift in how people were engaging with us, or with me as a case. I was not representing the company, but there were people representing the company there, right? And the way you sit at the table and you're happy to and you're able to have a conversation changes by the trust that is rebuilt on this day-to-day experience. There's definitely a point to it, a point to humanizing, to continue what you're doing, continue your communication, being consistent on the response that is being offered.
That was very important. And I think I emphasize here again that also this point will be mentioned and more elaborated in our next webinar that will be on June 11th at 11 a.m. when we talk about remediation, stakeholder engagement to regain trust and rebuild reputation. Today we have learned that it is important to prepare for a crisis, and in best cases to prevent crisis, as crisis always hits at a bad timing. I wish you a very nice afternoon and hope to see you soon again, maybe in our next webinar. Bye-bye.